Libyan desert. Deep night. 1942. There is no front line here. Only distance. Only silence stretched so far it begins to feel physical. A small group of modified jeeps sits in the shadow of a low ridge. Engines cooled. Headlights blacked out. Silhouettes barely distinguishable from the terrain itself. These are not conventional patrol units. They belong to the Special Air Service, operating far beyond the range where standard supply logic makes sense. Maps are folded and refolded in dim red light. Coordinates are memorized, not referenced. The target lies deep inside Axis-controlled territory, airfields and supply nodes that sustain the forward momentum of German and Italian forces in Libya. In the distance, faint engine echoes occasionally pass through the desert wind. Axis patrols, supply convoys, aircraft movement cycles tied to fragile logistics stretching back toward the coast. In normal doctrine, this would be considered unreachable terrain for small units. But doctrine has already begun to fail in this environment. The desert does not respect front lines. It absorbs them. And in this space, a different kind of warfare has emerged, fast, silent, and deliberately unpredictable. Within Allied command structures, there is unease. Reports are arriving describing deep penetrations far beyond planned operational boundaries. Supply depots struck. Airfields disrupted. Convoy routes collapsing temporarily without clear attribution. Some assessments question coordination. Others question control. The men in these jeeps are not waiting for confirmation. They're already moving according to a different logic. One where speed and initiative matter more than layered authorization chains. And as engines begin to start in near silence, the desert ahead becomes less like terrain and more like a system about to be interrupted. Behind them, no clear command response has fully formed. Ahead of them, the Axis supply network continues operating, unaware that it is already being mapped for disruption. And in the gap between those two realities, the raid is about to begin. 2. Context/background. Section 1. By early 1942, the North African campaign had become a war of movement defined less by front lines and more by supply endurance. Across Libya and Egypt, control shifted not only through battlefield victories, but through the ability to sustain fuel, ammunition, and food across vast desert distances. Armies advanced or stalled based on logistics more than raw combat strength. This environment created a unique vulnerability. Unlike Europe, where supply lines could be layered through rail networks and dense infrastructure, the desert offered only narrow logistical corridors, coastal roads, isolated depots, and air transport nodes spaced hundreds of kilometers apart. The Axis forces, led primarily by German and Italian formations, rely heavily on these fragile routes to sustain operations in Libya. Every forward position depended on long, exposed supply chains stretching back toward Tripoli and Benghazi. In this structure, airfields and fuel depots became critical nodes rather than supporting infrastructure. If these points were disrupted, entire operational sectors could stall within days. This is the environment into which British special operations began to evolve a new form of warfare. Conventional engagements between the British Eighth Army and Axis forces often produce shifting tactical outcomes. but rarely decisive strategic collapse. Even after battlefield losses, Axis forces could often reconstitute combat capability as long as supply infrastructure remained intact. This created a doctrinal shift in thinking inside Allied planning circles. If direct confrontation could not consistently produce strategic breakdown, then indirect disruption of logistics might. This idea became increasingly relevant as mobile desert warfare expanded in scale. Armored formations, reconnaissance units, and air support groups all depended on predictable resupply cycles. Interrupting those cycles, it did not require defeating entire armies, only disabling the infrastructure that sustained them. Airfields were especially important. Forward air bases allowed the German Luftwaffe to provide reconnaissance, close air support, and rapid response capabilities across wide desert sectors. Without them, ground forces lost visibility and coordination advantage over long distances. Fuel depots were equally critical. A single destroyed fuel cache could immobilize entire armored formations, forcing operational pauses that shifted momentum across the front. It is within this context that deep penetration raids began to gain strategic attention. Yet the desert itself enabled such operations in a way that European terrain did not. Its openness allowed movement, but its emptiness also meant that small units could traverse long distances without immediate detection if they avoided predictable routes. At the same time, the lack of infrastructure meant that once inside enemy territory, a raiding force could not rely on local support or reinforcement. Success depended entirely on mobility, navigation, and timing. This balance of opportunity and isolation defined the emerging doctrine. Within British command discussions, there was still hesitation about committing significant trust to such methods. Traditional military thinking emphasized massed force, clear lines of control, and measurable territorial gain. Small unit raids did not fit neatly into these categories. Their effects were often indirect, delayed, or difficult to quantify immediately after execution. Yet reports from early operations suggested something important. Even short disruptions behind Axis lines forced disproportionate reactions. Convoys were rerouted. Air patrols increased. Logistics schedules were altered. In some cases, entire operational plans had to be adjusted due to uncertainty, due about rear area security. This was not destruction in the conventional sense. It was systemic interference. Meanwhile, Axis forces operating in Libya were adapting to desert warfare through experience rather than doctrine. German and Italian units developed increasingly efficient mobile formations under commanders who understood the importance of speed and coordination in open terrain. But this adaptation came with a blind spot. Rear area security was often treated as secondary to frontline engagement. The assumption was that distance itself provided protection, especially against small enemy units operating far beyond conventional supply reach. That assumption would prove increasingly fragile. Because distance in the desert was not protection, it was space without surveillance continuity. And in that space, small forces could move in ways that larger formations could not easily track or predict. At the center of this emerging shift was a growing recognition within Allied circles. If the Desert War was fundamentally a logistics war, then logistics itself could become the primary battlefield. Not tanks, not territory, but supply lines, fuel storage, and operational timing And as this realization developed, a new form of unit structure began to take shape, one designed not to hold ground, but to penetrate it, disrupt it, and disappear before a coherent response could form. That structure would soon be tested in its most extreme form by the Special Air Service, under the leadership of David Sterling, in operations that would push far beyond the expectations of conventional command doctrine. And once those operations began, the question of control versus initiative would no longer remain theoretical. It would become a live operational conflict inside the Allied war effort itself. 2. Context/background, Section 2. As the North African campaign intensified, the British Army's command structure in the desert became increasingly complex, stretched between traditional hierarchy and the rapid demands of mobile warfare. At the center of this tension stood the Special Air Service, a formation created for deep penetration raids behind Axis lines. Its early development was driven by the belief that small, highly mobile teams could achieve disproportionate effects by striking logistics nodes rather than frontline formations. The concept was radical for its time. Instead of holding ground or engaging in sustained battles, these units were designed to move in through empty desert corridors, bypassing established fronts entirely, and striking where the enemy was least prepared. Fuel depots, airfields, transport convoys, and communication hubs. This approach was closely associated with David Sterling, whose operational vision emphasized speed, deception, and independence from conventional supply chains. Sterling's idea was not simply tactical, it was structural. He viewed the desert as a space where traditional command and control systems became too slow to respond effectively. In such an environment, initiative at the lowest level, you could outperform centralized planning. However, this created friction within broader Allied command systems. The British Eighth Army, like most conventional forces of the time, rely on layered authorization, coordinated offensives, and carefully timed operations. Commanders expected units to operate within clearly defined operational boundaries, with predictable communication and reinforcement structures. SAS operations often challenged this expectation. Deep raids required prolonged separation from friendly lines, minimal communication, and rapid decision-making in isolation. These factors made it difficult for higher command to track operations in real time, or to fully assess their progress until after completion. This gap in visibility created uncertainty at command level. Some officers viewed these operations as high-risk but strategically valuable disruptions. Others saw them as difficult to control, difficult to evaluate, and potentially inefficient compared to conventional battlefield engagements. This debate was not simply doctrinal, it was also logistical. Supplying deep penetration units in the desert was inherently complex. Fuel, water, ammunition, and spare parts had to be carefully calculated for missions that could extend far beyond expected timelines due to navigation uncertainty or enemy contact. Even minor deviations in terrain or timing could significantly alter mission duration and risk exposure. Despite these challenges, early SAS operations demonstrated a consistent pattern. When successful, they forced Axis forces to divert disproportionate resources into rear area security. This included increased convoy escorts, expanded airfield patrols, and the redistribution of forces away from frontline operations to protect infrastructure that had previously been considered safe due to its distance from combat zones. Within Axis command structures, particularly among German forces, this created a persistent operational irritation. Rear zones were no longer secure by geography alone. They now required active defense, which diluted overall combat efficiency across the theater. The German Luftwaffe was especially affected in forward operating regions, where airfields had to be defended not only against aerial attack, but also against ground infiltration raids. As a result, operational tempo began to shift. Instead of focusing purely on offensive sorties and reconnaissance missions, air units were increasingly required to allocate manpower and resources toward perimeter security and rapid response readiness. This change reduced efficiency without necessarily increasing safety. At the same time, intelligence reporting from both sides struggled to accurately capture the full impact of these raids. Many SAS operations occurred deep behind enemy lines, where verification of results was delayed or incomplete. This created a recurring problem in assessment. Tactical success could be confirmed locally, but strategic impact often took time to appear in measurable form. Supply delays, disrupted convoy schedules, and temporary airfield closures often only became visible when broader operational patterns were analyzed over days or weeks. By then, the raiding unit had already moved on. This separation between action and evaluation became one of the defining characteristics of special operations warfare in the desert. It also contributed to misunderstanding at higher command levels, where immediate battlefield metrics were still the primary method of assessing effectiveness. Yet despite skepticism, the cumulative effect of repeated raids began to influence operational planning at a higher level. Axis commanders were forced to consider not just frontline threats, but also the possibility of disruption deep in their rear areas. This expanded their defensive planning burden across a much larger geographical space. In practical terms, it meant that no area of the desert could be considered entirely safe. And that realization gradually changed the nature of the campaign. What had begun as a conventional struggle between armies was evolving into a layered conflict where mobility, intelligence, and unpredictability mattered as much as firepower. As these pressures accumulated, SAS units prepared for a new phase of operations, larger, deeper, and more ambitious raids designed not just to harass supply lines, but to disrupt entire operational sectors. And as those missions began to unfold, the tension between autonomy in the field and control at headquarters would reach its most critical point yet. 3. Angles, Section 1. By mid-1942, the SAS operations in North Africa were no longer being judged only as isolated raids. They had become part of a broader struggle over how the Desert War itself should be fought. The first angle is operational depth and vulnerability. Axis forces in Libya depended on layered logistics that stretched from coastal ports inland toward forward supply points. Each layer added delay, but also created dependency. Fuel moved in convoys. Ammunition followed scheduled distribution routes. Air operations depended on fixed forward bases. This system worked only as long as the rear remained stable. The German Luftwaffe played a critical role in sustaining that stability. Forward airfields provided reconnaissance over vast desert distances, helping to protect convoys and identify enemy movement before contact occurred. But this also created fixed points of failure. Airfields, fuel depots, and convoy staging areas were not easily movable. Once established, they became predictable nodes in an otherwise fluid environment. This predictability made them vulnerable to deep penetration raids. The second angle is operational asymmetry. Conventional warfare in North Africa involved large formations engaging in coordinated maneuvers across open terrain. Success was often measured in territorial gain or loss, and in the ability to sustain momentum across extended supply lines. SAS operations inverted this logic. Instead of meeting Axis forces directly, they targeted the infrastructure that allowed those forces to function at scale. A single destroyed fuel dump could immobilize armored units far larger than the raiding party itself. A disrupted airfield could reduce reconnaissance coverage across hundreds of kilometers of desert. This created a form of asymmetry where small actions produced disproportionately large operational consequences. The third angle is command friction. Within the Special Air Service, operational independence was not an exception, it was a requirement. Units operated with limited communication once deployed. Radio silence was often necessary to avoid detection, which meant that real-time coordination with higher command was minimal. This created tension with traditional command structures that relied on continuous reporting and centralized oversight. For senior commanders, this made SAS operations difficult to integrate into broader campaign planning. For field units, it was the only viable way to operate deep inside enemy-controlled territory. The fourth angle is intelligence uncertainty. Desert intelligence in 1942 was incomplete by the nature, vast distances, shifting patrol patterns, and limited aerial reconnaissance meant that both sides operated with partial information. This uncertainty affected planning on both sides of the conflict. For SAS units, it meant that targets were often identified through reconnaissance cycles that could be days or weeks old. For Axis forces, it meant that rear area security could never be fully optimized, because threats could emerge from any direction without predictable timing. This informational gap created constant operational friction. The fifth angle is psychological pressure on rear area forces. Even when raids were small in scale, their impact on perception was disproportionately large. Axis supply troops, airfield personnel, and convoy escorts had to operate under the assumption that rear areas were no longer secure by default. This altered behavior. Convoy speeds were reduced. Patrols were increased. Defensive posture extended deeper into logistical zones that had previously been considered low risk. The result was a gradual reduction in operational efficiency across the entire supply system. The sixth angle is adaptability under constraint. Unlike conventional infantry units, SAS patrols had to operate with strict limitations on fuel, water, ammunition, and mechanical support. Every mission required precise calculation of range, consumption, and recovery probability. There was no expectation of resupply during operations. This forced a level of discipline that influenced how missions were executed. Engagements were selective. Targets were prioritized based on impact rather than opportunity. This constraint-driven approach became a defining feature of their effectiveness. It also meant that success depended heavily on navigation accuracy and timing, not just combat capability. As these operational patterns evolved, SAS raids began to produce effects that extended beyond immediate battlefield damage. They influenced how Axis commanders allocated resources across entire regions. They forced defensive restructuring in areas previously considered secure. And they introduced uncertainty into logistical planning that could not easily be resolved through conventional military adjustments. But this was only one side of the equation. Because as these raids increased in scale and frequency, Axis forces also began to adapt, tightening convoy protection, reinforcing airfield defenses, and attempting to track raiding patterns across the desert. This emerging cycle of action and counteraction would soon lead both sides toward more intense confrontations. And in that escalation, the limits of deep penetration warfare would be tested under increasingly complex operational conditions. 3. U-angles. Section 2. As SAS operations expanded across the Libyan desert, the nature of Axis countermeasures began to evolve in response to an increasingly unpredictable threat environment. The seventh angle is defensive overstretch. German and Italian forces in North Africa were already operating under significant logistical strain. Supply lines stretched across vast distances from ports such as Tripoli and Benghazi, passing through exposed routes vulnerable to air attack, mechanical failure, and interception. Within this structure, rear area security was never fully separable from frontline combat requirements. Every additional unit assigned to convoy in protection or airfield defense was a unit removed from offensive operations at the front. As SAS raids increased pressure on these rear zones, Axis commanders were forced into continuous redistribution of manpower. This did not eliminate vulnerability, it dispersed it. The German Luftwaffe was particularly affected. Airfields required both operational crews for flight operations and ground personnel for maintenance and defense. As raids targeted these installations, more personnel were reassigned to guard duty, reducing efficiency in sortie generation. Aircraft readiness rates were indirectly impacted, not always through physical destruction, but through reduced maintenance, throughput, and operational delays. The eighth angle is intelligence distortion. In a theater as vast and fluid as the North African desert, intelligence was inherently fragmented. Reports often arrived delayed, incomplete, or inconsistent across different units. SAS operations exploited this fragmentation because they moved quickly and avoided sustained engagement. Their presence was often confirmed only after the fact, through damaged infrastructure, disrupted convoys, or intercepted communication fragments. This created a persistent uncertainty in Axis command assessments. Commanders could not reliably determine whether reported incidents represented isolated events or part of a larger coordinated pattern. That uncertainty forced conservative defensive responses, which in turn reduced operational efficiency. The ninth angle is environmental navigation warfare. The desert itself functioned as both battlefield and barrier. For conventional forces, navigation relied heavily on established routes, landmarks, and convoy coordination. For SAS units, navigation required a different methodology: celestial positioning, terrain interpretation, and long-range movement planning without guaranteed reference points. This created a mobility advantage. Small units could move across areas that larger formations would avoid due to logistical risk. They could also exploit terrain features such as wadis, dune formations, and open flats to approach targets from unexpected directions. However, this advantage came with high operational risk. Navigation errors in the desert were not minor. They were potentially mission-ending. Fuel miscalculation or directional drift could result in total loss of operational capability far from recovery routes. The 10th angle is escalation pressure on Axis operational planning. As SAS raids continued, Axis commanders were forced to assume that any rear area installation could be a potential target, regardless of distance from the front line. This changed defensive doctrine from reactive to anticipatory. Instead of responding only to confirmed threats, forces had to allocate resources toward potential threats across a wide geographical range. This diluted concentration of effort at the front. It also introduced inefficiencies into supply cycles, as convoys required additional protection and scheduling adjustments to reduce exposure windows. The 11th angle is psychological fatigue in rear units. While frontline combat received most historical attention, rear area personnel often experience sustained stress due to unpredictability of threat. Airfield crews, convoy drivers, and depot personnel operated under conditions where the timing and location of attacks could not be reliably predicted. Even when raids were infrequent, their impact persisted in operational behavior. Increased alertness, reduced rest cycles, and heightened defensive posture all contributed to gradual fatigue across logistical networks. The 12th angle is doctrinal evolution within Allied command. Over time, repeated SAS successes forced a gradual reassessment of special operations within broader campaign planning. What began as experimental raiding tactics evolved into a recognized operational tool for disrupting enemy logistics. However, integration into conventional command structures remained incomplete. The same characteristics that made SAS units effective, autonomy, speed, and limited communication, also made them difficult to incorporate into centralized planning systems. This created a dual-track structure within Allied operations in North Africa. Conventional forces focused on frontline engagement and territorial control. Special operations forces focused on disruption, mobility, and systemic interference. Both contributed to the campaign, but they operated under fundamentally different assumptions about how war in the desert should be conducted. As this divergence deepened, SAS operations moved toward larger and more ambitious objectives, targeting not just individual convoys or depots, but entire operational networks supporting Axis movement across Libya. And with that shift, the stage was set for direct confrontation between doctrine and execution at scale. 4. Climax/turning point. Section 1. Libya. Deep desert. Mid-1942. There's a point in desert warfare where maps stop meaning safety. Only direction remains. Only distance. A small SAS patrol moves through that emptiness in near total silence. Engines restrained. Headlights sealed. Movement timed between known Axis patrol cycles. They are deep behind